Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizengauzen. Today is October 19th and we have a lot of interesting news. In this episode, after Ukrainian drone attacks, Russian industrial giants are burning and Belgorod is heading down to the basements. Our drones hit two major targets overnight. A political nightmare is brewing in Hungary, and Putin is once again bargaining over Donbas. The vice president of Hungary is forcing the Democrats to kneel before Donald Trump, and Trump himself has released a very strange video. Steve Witkoff is defending the rights of Russian speakers, and the so-called eternal peace in Gaza lasted only a week. We'll be talking about this and much more in today's episode. There's a lot of interesting stuff ahead. If you're new to this channel, subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. So, as usual, let's start with the sanctions from Hungary, of the Ukrainian drone forces, the main intelligence directorate, and the security service of Ukraine. A fire broke out at a Russian gas plant in Orenburg after a drone attack. According to Russian authorities, Ukrainian drones attacked a gas plant in the Orenburg region, resulting in a fire there. So, you see, now they're actually calling it a fire, not just a pop or smoke. According to the local governor, there were no casualties, but part of the infrastructure was damaged. This Orenburg gas processing plant is one of the largest gas chemical enterprises in Russia, with an annual capacity of almost 40 billion cubic meters of natural gas. Just imagine, it's the second largest gas processing plant after the Amur GPP in Russia, which means it's a very significant facility. In addition to butane, propane, and liquefied gas, this plant also produces sulfur and sulfur dioxide. In other words, it works at full capacity for the Russian military-industrial complex. It's like a real little town where several thousand people work. All in all, it's a very, very significant target. By the way, it's located on the border with Kazakhstan. Most likely, once again, the Russians will start yelling that something flew in from Kazakhstan. Well, it's coming from Ukraine. You need to finally understand that Ukraine has drones that can travel over 2,000 kilometers, and soon there will be even more. By the way, the one thing that really sticks in my mind, everything I probably know about Orenburg, is the song, I think it was sung by Zikina, about that Orenburg downy shawl. Yes, I'm that old. I'm so old that I remember that. Back in the day, do you remember, was it the Mesozoic era? When you needed to call your child in from outside, there were no mobile phones, so you had to lean out and shout their name across the whole yard, like, "Come home, let's go." And if they're not in the yard, what do you do then? Life hack. Carrier pigeon. I mean, you'd grab another kid and say, "Run over there to building 16 or wherever and call Boris." If he's not there, well, that's it. Then the parents would come out themselves, but that was the last resort if you didn't come home on time. By the way, I studied in a sports class and I had training before lessons and after. Just imagine little me in the first shift, before classes, even before lessons you had to get to training at around 6 in the morning. And getting on public transport was just a nightmare, so crowded, packed with people. And there I was, this little kid with that jerk, with a giant backpack almost as big as me. Just to get on the trolley bus and ride a few stops to school, I had to take a running start and try to squeeze in there. So when I watched all those foreign movies, where kids were driven to school in those nice yellow buses, it seemed to me like something made up just for the movies. I couldn't believe that could actually exist in real life. Like in those American movies, where every kid has their own bike and they're always riding to some beautiful lake. But where are all those construction sites with exposed rebar where you have to play hide and seek, huh? And what about jumping across garage rooftops? Every courtyard had those garages, or at least there was one nearby. And we would jump across those garages, and between them, I don't know, someone always left just enough space that if you fell in, it was hard to get out on your own. Kids would shout, "Run around, call for adults." Someone had fallen between the garages. That always happened, without fail. And you know what else? My brother and I, we had one bike for the two of us. That was honestly the cruelest thing you could come up with in childhood. We had to take turns riding it. Everyone else would go off on their bikes, and if it was my brother's turn, I'd just be wandering around the yard alone. Me and that one kid. Every yard had him, the kid who came to stay with his grandma for the summer. He was either red from getting sunburned or pale because he hadn't had time to get sunburned yet. And he hadn't made any friends yet. He'd just been sent to his grandma's for the summer, and you're wandering around thinking, well, I guess I'll go talk to this kid at least. But I was born in Crimea, in Sevastopol, and all these other kids, they were from some capitals, from other cities, so it was kind of hard to find common ground. Okay, I got a bit sidetracked, sorry. That's already a famous phrase on this show, about the attack on these giant factories. But that's not all. In addition to the gas processing plant in Orenburg, an oil refinery in Novokuybyshevsk, which is in the Samara region, was also attacked. This plant in Novokuybyshevsk doesn't just produce regular fuel, but also fuel for jet engines and oils for rocket carriers. Its annual capacity is almost 9 million tons of oil. So it's an average-sized oil refinery in terms of processing. Well, the other one is huge, this one is average. 2 major targets, 2 serious targets hit in one night, and this plant is even bigger. The gas processing plant will be, and it already employs more than 4,000 people. Just imagine what a giant operation that is. It was only recently shut down, this Novokuybyshevsky plant, so they were already getting hit there. Small but proud Ukrainian drones struck it, and this giant was shut down on August 2nd. It had just started operating again, but not for long. Drones hit it again. In other words, the unmanned systems forces are working excellently. Yesterday, I shared statistics. Nearly 60 major targets have already been attacked this month, which is more than in the entire previous month. So, Ukraine is ramping up the pace, and once again, the best sanctions are those from the Hungarians, from the unmanned systems forces, from the armed forces of Ukraine, from the GUR, and from the SBU. But that's not all. The GUR published intercepted conversations from Belgorod on their Telegram channel, and judging by them, the mood there is very bleak. In fact, a collapse is starting. Some businesses are shutting down. Some people are hiding in basements because alarms go off frequently. As they say, now you can feel for yourself what Ukrainians have been experiencing for the 4th year in a row. That is, when this war began, I think people in Belgorod and Kursk were sitting there thinking, God, never in our lives. How could this happen? We are great Russia, we have a great army, we have this, we have that. War will never come back here. Not only did it come back, but I think the residents of the Kursk and Belgorod regions can tell other Russians that war is not as victorious and not as fun as Solovyov, the propagandist on TV, makes it out to be. So they intercepted a conversation verbatim. We're constantly running back and forth. As soon as it quiets down, it starts again and we go back to the shelter. I spent 70% of my time on the ground floor rather than at work. Basically, some people take cover, some don't. I'm afraid something might hit us. We have some kind of factory or something nearby, and so on and so on. So, according to this Russian woman who was complaining to some acquaintance of hers on the phone, with such efficiency, it would have been easier to just send everyone home and stop work altogether. Well, what can you do? I went into the local Belgorod social media groups to see what kind of news they have there. And here's the news. The Russian government has allocated funds to the Belgorod region for the purchase of generators. In other words, the government is preparing the Belgorod region for the fact that since they couldn't manage to cause a blackout in Ukraine, you'll have one instead. The main question is, if you already have a fuel problem there, what are you planning to use to power these generators, right? Believe me, the only thing worth mentioning right away is that Putin absolutely doesn't care whether people in Belgorod have electricity or not, water or not, and so on. He couldn't care less. But if Moscow were left without power, and for so long that everything was running on generators and everything came to a halt, then maybe that would clear things up a bit in the minds of those who live there. If only the residents of Belgorod region had known, when Putin started this war, that they would have to get down on their knees before Putin. Do you remember that address? They got down on their knees and said, Putin, give us some money to rebuild our homes, please. They had to go down into the basement. Do you think they would have been happy then? Oh, I remember how they were all like, now we'll deal with Ukraine any moment now. And speaking of those people, Putin made it impossible for them to advance. I'm talking about the Ukrainian heroes who are now showing Russia that you should never have come to our land, about real heroes. Let me remind you, friends, we have an important fundraiser for the legendary Azov. I think Azov needs no introduction. We are raising funds for the Special Forces Sniper Unit of the 1st of the Azov Brigade Corps. We are collecting for reconnaissance drones, which they urgently need right now, as they are currently defending in the Pokrovsk direction. In other words, the snipers of the Azov Special Forces unit, just hearing that phrase makes many Russians uneasy. So let's help our warriors. Azov is a legend, and I think we'll close this fundraiser quickly. And I always want to say a huge thank you to you. And watch this video. The fighters recorded it especially for us and for you.
Слава Україні! Ми загін снайперів спеціального призначення бригади Азов. Звертаємося до Бориса Тизенгаузена та його спільноти за допомогою. Для виконання спеціальних задач наш загін потребує розвідувальних дронів. Будемо вдячні кожному і кожній. Слава нації!
Let's help our heroes. The link to donate is in the description of this video. There's Mono, there's Privat, and there's PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. I see everyone, and I want to say a huge thank you to all of you, to everyone who supports Ukraine and our defenders. If for some reason you don't see the details down here, there's a QR code that also leads to the donation page. And of course, how could we go without Donald Trump? This morning, I came across some very interesting news. So Donald Trump published a video created with artificial intelligence where he's wearing a golden crown. He's Donald Trump at the controls of a fighter jet, bombing, with feces those who are protesting against him. You know, right now protests called No to Kings have swept across the United States. They're against Donald Trump's policies. So basically, when I watched it, he really is throwing what looks like feces down on those protesters. You know, I found that very telling. If you look at it closely, it's a typical display of this kind of narcissistic regression. That is when an adult is in a stressful situation. And in this case, I think that these protests really infuriated Donald Trump, especially when there's direct criticism, when there's protest. And the adult reverts to childish behaviors to protect their ego. Like, I'm going to fly up in my plane, throw crap at all of you, I'm the king with a crown. That's why I always talk about these kinds of moments and this kind of reaction. Well, that's just how Donald Trump is. But the point is, for those working with our delegation, when we're communicating and preparing a meeting with Donald Trump, there needs to be an understanding of how the US president perceives things. And what level of argumentation which pleasure centers need to be engaged. And from a political standpoint, of course, Trump is a tough move. When Trump replaces rational discussion like, so what are you protesting against? Let's talk about it. No, he replaces it with a visual show. In other words, he shifts the conversation from the realm of arguments to the realm of, I'll dump a load of crap on you, and that's it. And in this battle, the winner isn't the one who's right, but the one who's louder, funnier, more flamboyant, more confident. So it's a show. If you turn it into a show, then in this case, Donald Trump won by dumping crap on them from above. Well, who is it that understands very well what Donald Trump will like? Let's see, who is it? It's Vice President Vance. He also posted an AI-generated video in which Trump appears as a king, also wearing a crown. Well, it's clear that this is a reference. There's no king, but here I am, the king. And in front of him, Donald Trump, in a crown with a sword in this royal mantle, kneel, the key representatives of the US Democratic Party. And Trump reposted this video on his own page. So that's the response to No Kings, to this campaign that, thanks to the Democrats, has flared up again in the US. Yes, and you could say, that's not all. Donald Trump, the former president, reportedly wants to build a grand triumphal arch in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. At one of the charity events, Donald Trump presented a model of a triumphal arch in the classical style, which they want to install in Washington in 2026 to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States. So the arch is it's quite similar to a triumphal arch, and there's also a golden figure of an angel on it. Now people are starting to spread rumors that the angel is supposed to have Trump's face, but that's actually fake. And so this is what the arch will look like. But what's interesting is how Donald Trump responded to a journalist, coming up in a moment, about what this arch is and why he wants to build it. And by the way, just in the last episode we talked about architecture, immortality, and megalomania, like how Napoleon built his triumphal arch, and how Saddam Hussein restored Babylon. And on every brick there was an imprint of his name. And it was absolutely necessary to make it clear it was I, Saddam Hussein, who restored Babylon. But he considered himself the ancestor of the Babylonian kings. All in all, and a senior White House official said the idea for the arch came from Trump himself. It was he who developed the design and was involved in the process at every stage. And so, at the end of the press conference in the Oval Office, CBS reporter Ed O'Keefe asked Trump who it was for. Trump replied, "It will be perfect for me." And the journalist asked, "The Trump arch?" "It will be the Trump arch," and Trump smiled and nodded approvingly. A person of this type naturally wants something monumental to be left behind after him. It's a good idea, really, like a triumphal arch. The main question is, well, it's clear that the United States is turning 250, but what victories will there be? We'll get to all these wars a bit later, the ones that have ended but not really ended. In general, the cost and timeline for building the arch are still unknown. It will be constructed with private donations. I'm telling you all this not just so you can draw your own conclusions, but also so I can understand certain things myself and know what to expect from a politician with this kind of psychological profile. That is, if this politician is the President of the United States, then this understanding determines. And the fate of your country, in particular ours, depends on this. That is, a lot depends on whether they will provide aid or not, and so on. Whether he will put pressure on Putin or not, impose sanctions or not. So a lot depends on this. Yes, right now Ukrainians are heroically holding back this onslaught. By the way, the Russians have once again launched an offensive almost along the entire front, but they aren't having much success. But when Donald Trump says that he could end this war in 24 hours, I don't think so, but he could have done it in 6 months. That is, if there had been tough sanctions right away, if long-range weapons had been provided immediately, then perhaps this pressure would already be having an effect now. And let me remind you, if the same had been done under the administration of Joseph Biden, perhaps everything would have ended even earlier. And in the European Union, the upcoming meeting between Donald Trump and Putin in Hungary has been called a political nightmare. Holding the meeting in the Hungarian capital puts European leaders and NATO officials in a very awkward position, since the war in Ukraine will be discussed in an EU country, but without the participation of the bloc itself. And one of the European diplomats specifically noted that the particular location was carefully chosen, quite naturally, by the Russian side, because, well, Hungary itself is truly the embodiment of confrontation, of disagreements within the European Union when it comes to relations with Russia. And I really liked the opinion of Harvard University expert Alberto Alemano, who explained that this meeting will give Orban the right to speak and act on behalf of the European Union, even though his position on the war contradicts the common position of the European Union. Well, now comes the most interesting part. What exactly did Putin propose to Trump over the phone that made him suddenly set aside the Agavkov issue and the topic of sanctions and agree to a meeting in Hungary? After all, just going there for no reason, well, Trump has other things to do. So Putin must have proposed something that made Trump think, oh, this could actually work. And here's what the Washington Post writes about this. During a phone conversation with Trump this week, Putin demanded that Kyiv hand over full control of Donbas to Russia as a condition for ending the war. But Putin has not been able to conquer Donbas for 11 years. Let me remind you, he hasn't managed to conquer Donbas in 11 years. He has repeatedly been pushed back. There are some very serious defensive structures have been built on our side. And in the phone conversation between Trump and Putin, Putin indicated that he was ready to give up parts of the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. This is all according to the Washington Post, in exchange for full control over Donbas. And here is where the devil is in the details. Some began to interpret this as Putin being ready to leave the occupied part of Kherson region and Zaporizhia in exchange for being given full control over Donbas. But that's not the case. He simply said the following, that he would not fully occupy the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, which, I remind you, he hasn't conquered anyway, hasn't occupied, you see? In other words, he said, I won't conquer what I haven't conquered. In response, withdraw your troops from Donbas. So basically, he's just asking our troops to leave from there. That's all. Of course, there's no talk of a ceasefire. And I think those who read in Ukraine and follow Telegram channels, which is most people because that's where you get alerts about air raids, drone and missile attacks, saw yesterday a warning about a possible massive shelling in the coming days and the redeployment of Russian strategic aviation. So that's what negotiations with Russia look like. In other words, Putin is once again trying to sell it. Let me remind you, Kherson was occupied, but the Russian troops were kicked out of there. Our defenders drove them out. And now he says, fine, I won't occupy what I couldn't take anyway. So give me even more territory then. So what's the benefit here? Why is Donald Trump flying to Hungary? Donald Trump himself, let me remind you, recently stated that both Russia and Ukraine should stop where they are now, meaning along the current front line. But Putin doesn't want that. He wants to be given what he hasn't been able to occupy in 11 years. I think that this time too, Donald, Trump is pinning his hopes on his negotiation skills and thinks he can somehow persuade Putin. But you can only persuade Putin when Tomahawks start flying to take out oil refineries and ports, when the war budget deficit reaches record levels and keeps growing rapidly, and Putin is physically unable to continue the war. That's when you can persuade him. And here's another interesting point. Also, officials who provided these insights reported that Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, pressured the Ukrainian delegation during Friday's meeting regarding the transfer of Donbas, noting that the region is predominantly Russian-speaking. Well, in that case, it turns out Witkoff was worked over by Putin for 5 hours. Remember, Trump was outraged that they discussed things there for 5 hours. So it turns out that the 5-hour persuasion session wasn't for nothing. But this is the same old dreary Russian narrative. So let's follow this same logic just to make it clear. Let's say, since there are regions in the US where people predominantly speak Spanish, Del Rio, Pecos, El Paso, Rio Grande, let's just give them to Mexico, right? That's the logic here, isn't it? Miami. More than 60% consider Spanish their native language. 66%. Should we give it to Mexico? Well, according to this logic. And Steve Witkoff? So all these stories about... That's Putin in the mix. Witkoff is just so gullible. And Trump said himself that when he flew there, he didn't know anything about Putin. So who sent him there? He didn't know anything about Putin or about Russia or about how Russians operate. So who sent him there, really? By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. By the way, the population of Miami, which I mentioned, is 433,000 people, and on our main channel we already have more than 458,000. On the English language channel we already have over 10,000 subscribers, so there are enough of us now that we could create our own Miami. It's just incredible, wonderful, delightful, fantastic, as Donald would say. If you're watching without subscribing, or it's your first time here, of course, subscribe and hit the bell. Calm analysis is exactly what we need right now in this turbulent world. And since I am a certified stickler, let me remind you that Witkoff was the main White House communicator with the Kremlin before the meeting in Anchorage, which, according to European diplomats, led to a misunderstanding of Russia's intentions. And at that time, I was just shocked by this fact. Trump thought that Putin was ready to completely withdraw from the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, but it turns out that Witkoff misunderstood at the time. And Putin was saying the same thing I mentioned earlier. I'm ready not to occupy anything else. But Witkoff misunderstood. How, at a meeting of this level on such a topic, do you not clarify? Do you not take notes? How is that possible? The most surprising thing to me is that Steve Witkoff, after all this, remained the special representative for Russia and continues to play an important role in these processes. Well, as I understand it, even Trump isn't ready for another misunderstanding of what Putin said. So now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is responsible for preparing this Budapest summit with Putin. And of course, Kyiv views these changes positively. And Ukraine supported Trump's call for a ceasefire along the current front lines before negotiations. At this point, it's very important to keep hammering on this issue and to make statements at all levels almost every day. Deputies, parliament, the foreign ministry, and even the prime minister could get involved. To make statements that Ukraine supports Trump's call to ceasefire along the current front lines. So that those who don't want to do this, who don't want Donald Trump to hear it, and we all know who that Botox moth is, would be forced to show their position. That's why in Hungary, Russians can only be asked two questions. Are you ready to stop at the current front lines, and are you ready to cease fire along the current front lines? That's it. If it's necessary to address the root causes, if this starts up again. And it will start again, believe me. In Hungary, it will just be another round, another cycle of empty talk. So then, what's the point of all these pensioner gatherings? What's the point of sending these presidential planes? And here you can see that Marco Rubio has gotten involved after all. Before the Trump-Putin meeting in Budapest, the sides are planning to hold lower-level meetings. There will be several more than there were before the meeting in Alaska. Well, at least here, they need to clarify their positions. At least there will be something written down on paper. Yeah, I just don't understand. How could they organize a summit in Alaska without clarifying their position after meeting with Putin? They sent the presidential planes, moved the motorcades there, hundreds of special agents. I think taxpayers understand that this is serious money. And it turns out they didn't quite get it right. By the way, I mentioned yesterday that in Russia they're starting to blame the West for the CIS project falling apart. Well, here's another piece of news to add to the pile. The Armenian Foreign Ministry stated that their country might apply for EU membership as early as November. The CIS project, just like the CSTO project, is falling apart not because of the West, as they think in Russia, but because Russia is ruled by a handful of spiteful old KGB men. They hiss on benches under the entrance, call everyone drug addicts and prostitutes, and try to whack those who are smaller with their canes. They're the ones who say, if only Stalin were here, if Stalin were around, you all would have been shot long ago. This is exactly the kind of team that's running the Russian Federation now. Well, here's another piece of news that was to be expected. The so-called eternal peace in the Gaza Strip didn't even last a week. So, Israel carried out strikes on Rafah in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, the IDF accuses Hamas of violating the ceasefire. And Hamas is trying to regain control over the border area. Well, who would have doubted it? Israel's Minister of National Security has already called on Prime Minister Netanyahu to resume military operations in the Gaza Strip. Well, what can you do? The only product Hamas exports is terrorism. When they crawled out of their tunnels and started shooting their own people in the Gaza Strip, I think it should have been clear to everyone that they are not interested in any kind of peaceful recovery until this terrorist proxy is completely destroyed, until the sponsor of these groups is punished. I'm talking about Iran. What kind of peace can we talk about? Now they'll take control of the financial flows that will go toward Gaza's reconstruction, bury their tunnels even deeper underground and wait for their moment, sitting there like a tick. It sits there just waiting. Meanwhile, Iran will accelerate its production of nuclear weapons. And one day, which will be far from pleasant, Iran will announce that it now has nuclear weapons. And anyone who strikes them will get a nuclear response. That's all there is to it. And at the same time, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others will start attacking Israel again, but this time taking into account the lessons learned. Their objective? What was their objective? To take as many hostages as possible. Children, women, the elderly, it doesn't matter. Well, that's pure terrorism, plain and simple. And this is what it means to slap together a piece quickly, to just tape it up with duct tape, thinking it'll somehow hold together. This is what happens when you don't finish off a terrorist whose life's goal, whose mission in this life is the destruction of the state of Israel. Well, in general, friends, I wish Israel strength and endurance, and the same to Ukraine in their fight against terrorism, against global terrorism, I would say. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and let's support the legendary Azov and our snipers. Let me remind you, the link to donate is in the description of this video. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.